Hey y'all. Hey y'all, welcome back to Chef Live. This week we are continuing May's theme of ChefConf Online having taken over the stream. And this week, all of the sessions that we recorded for ChefConf were Habitat, Chef Habitat, or application delivery centric. And so I need to really buy myself a thesaurus or just go on the internets and get one because excited is the only word that pops to mind again. But I'm really excited about this week's conversation because we have a couple of engineers from the internal Chef Habitat team. And so it's kind of going along the same theme we've had the last few weeks, but we also have a couple of engineers from one of our service integrator partners, Indellient. And so we're going to not only get to hear about the really cool work that our Habitat engineers have put into Habitat 1.5 release that we talked about earlier, and all the stuff that we're going to talk about at ChefConf on June 2nd. But we also get to talk to a couple of experts in implementing it in the field, and learn from their experiences, kind of how they started from the ground up with Habitat, and have done some like pretty amazing things, which I won't spoil. I'll let them talk about it when we get to it. So yeah, so for today's episode, I'm excited to like expand my own knowledge around Habitat. I've been at Chef as long as Habitat has been released, but I never have gotten to like really dig deep into it beyond like demos and kind of the basic like logging into a studio and building an Apache package or something like that. So I'm excited personally, selfishly, that I get to benefit from this conversation as well. And I get to kind of kick back because there are definitely plenty of awesome nuggets that we'll be able to get out of this conversation today. So my role today, I do talk a lot and I really do enjoy talking. So that's not a problem. But today my role is going to be more moderating the chat, keeping an eye out for your questions, so that these awesome engineers can all kind of discuss the different things that they've been working on, how they correlate, and kind of interact with each other, and then just, yeah, answer all your questions. So um, without further ado, I think first I should say, uh, one thing about a couple of our presenters. They have recorded a session this week as part of that Habitat ChefConf online experience. And so there is a lot of great information that is going to be released on June 2nd as part of ChefConf. So definitely hop over to chefconf.io and register to attend. If yeah, it's going to be amazing. So without further ado, I will launch into introducing each of our guests today, and I will I told them I was going to do it randomly before the stream started. So I'm going to pick Matt Wrock first. Matt Wrock, would you give us a little bit of your history here at Chef, or really your history in general, but also specifically at Chef, what you started out doing, when you started, and what you're working on now?
Yeah, I'd love to. My name's Matt Wrock, and I've been doing professional software development for about 20 years. And it's funny, like when you get to the 20-year mark, like you just say 20 years. So like you forget like it was in 21, 22. It's like it doesn't matter. But anyway, give or take a couple of years. But I started off kind of in the actually in the online advertising field. That's where I kind of really kind of got dug in, and was a C Sharp kind of SQL Server backend um, developer for like a good 15 years. Um, Anyways, but I was in that field for about 10 years. And then I thought, you know what? I've been at this company for like 9 years. I want to do something different. And like back when I first started, you know, you put your resume out and you just like, whoever bites. But like now, like I want to choose the company. And so I'm like Microsoft. And I kind of lost hope. Like my resume just kind of went off into the ether. And I actually accepted a position for this other company. And then like a week before I was supposed to start, like Microsoft calls me and it's like, oh, you know, we'd like to interview you. I'm like, okay. So I did that. And so anyway, long story, like I moved to Washington, and I'm back in Southern California, as you can see here. Now, but at that time, I moved to Washington, worked for Microsoft for about 5 years. That was an incredible experience. But then at the end, like of my Microsoft experience, I got really into like automation. So like because you know I'm working on these teams where we're like automating. Setting up environments, and it never went well. And I thought, like, there's got to be a better way. And so then I started getting into PowerShell. I discovered, you know, things like Chocolatey and started contributing to Chocolatey. Started contributing to things like, you know, Pester. And then a friend calls me up and says, hey, would you like to kind of do that, you know, on the data center level, like not just like your laptop? And I'm like, yeah, it sounds awesome. And they had just signed up with Chef, and so basically that was my entry. That was kind of my entry into like Chef. That was
Yeah.
so I worked there for about a year. Then things kind of changed there. Like the automation group kind of dispersed, and I wanted to keep doing automation. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just work for Chef. And so I called like this guy that I knew that I interacted a lot with at Chef, and was kind of central to Windows. Actually, you know, the first guy I talked to, that some people might know, Steve Murawski. He's kind of he's done a lot in just the Windows world and automation. So I talked to him and talked to a couple other people. And so 4 years ago, started at Chef. Probably about the first year, I was doing a lot of just Chef, what's known today as Chef infrastructure. And concentrating on kind of the Windows section, and then I started concentrating just on building Chef. Kind of went into the background scenes there, and then about 4 years ago, about 4 years ago, I started with Habitat, and I've been on Habitat ever since, and it's been just an incredible journey. So my main role on the Habitat, so I'm a software engineer on the Habitat team. And my main role is basically making sure that Habitat is a good experience on Windows. When I joined the Habitat team, there was no Habitat on Windows. And so my first order of business was just making it work. And so now we've kind of got that covered, and it's just making sure it's a good experience, that it plays well with the ecosystem, and so that's me.
That's awesome. That's from my own experience personally, working on like the Learn Chef platform and the tutorials that go into that. I can tell you my teammates and I all very much appreciate the work that you've put into Windows for Habitat. And Robin, Stellar Squall is his handle in there, I think. Hey, Echo Hack. Robin has done a lot of work with the Habitat and Windows stuff. So I'm excited that like everything is kind of pulling together too. Like we're getting to the place where we have these tutorials you can run through at the same time as we're really like beefing out our Windows resources, and not just in Habitat, but also last week we were talking about InSpec with Clinton Wolf, and like there's a conversation with Tim Smith and Lamont the week before about infra, and everybody has kind of got this focus on making it a lot easier with Windows. So anywho, my team appreciates it And I know a lot of other teams do too. So, cool. Well, let's go. We'll stay in the chef side of things, I guess, since I started there. And we'll move on to Ian Henry, who has also had quite a history with Habitat here at Chef as well. So, Ian, tell us, yeah, where you can start it out, what you're doing now, and whether there's like exciting things you're working on that you want to share.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how much of my life you care about. I guess we could go back to my birth if you all want to start there, and then we'll
Yeah, let's do that.
work through. I came to tech through video games, like half of the industry, I'm sure. I can remember like being a young lad and building out networks for LAN parties for my friends, and back in the early double aughts, late 90s. Yeah. Anyways, to be real,
That's a
like,
very common story too. I've
yeah,
like
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
that's
Like,
awesome.
it's
It's
the
always
only reason
games.
that I'm working in this field. Yeah, it really is. Like, and you know what, Mom? See, video games did make me into
Yeah.
something, right?
Exactly.
um yeah, and like all of that, having that context, I worked in tech sort of to put myself through college, where I got an English degree, as one does when you don't want to have to take college level trigonometry. So pretty straightforward. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I just knew that like I needed a degree and I didn't want to have to study complex math. And now I'm a full-time software engineer. So makes perfect sense.
So joke's on
I,
you, it turns out.
yeah, turns out, right, whatever. Yeah, I did like some small business network and systems consulting while I was in college to kind of pay my way through college, and from there I got just some random jobs working, like application administration, database administration, and help desk type stuff, and eventually moved into some systems work. And that's where I kind of caught the automation bug. So I was doing systems administration for an ISP, and having just no right to actually be working that job, but somebody gave me a break, and I learned, and that I learned very quickly. So that's kind of how I got into it, and from there we were doing, this was like back in 2010, I guess, would have been my first systems job. And yeah, that's weird. And yeah, and like we were working with like very early like Puppet and Spacewalk and Chef, and just kind of the very birth of the automation kind of DevOpsy wave. We were just an app or a systems admin team, and working with a lot of Solaris and FreeBSD and stuff. And that took my fancy, and I kind of learned as much about that as I could. And then I started doing consulting and was doing just kind of automation and tools consulting, doing a little bit of application development in the case where some kind of tool was involved. And I ended up picking up a contract with a customer. I was working for GE Aviation, and I met, while I was contracted there, I met Stephen Lauk. Some of you maybe know Stephen. He's also a longtime chef person.
Let me guess, he
And
was wearing black jeans and a black t-shirt.
he was wearing black jeans and a black t-shirt, and I probably was as well. And I can remember we were like a whole group of us went out for lunch, and he was just asking like, how long have you been doing this, and kind of where are you at with it? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I've been doing automation consulting now for a few years, and whatever, picking up whatever contracts and making whatever money I can. And he's like, you should just come and do this for us. And I was like, all right. So I applied, and that was 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago. So I have been at Chef for 5 years.
That's
Um,
crazy.
yeah, my first year at Chef was doing customer facing engineering. So it was the similar task to what I'd been doing before. And that was a wild ride. I don't know if any of you have ever done, I mean, I'm sure that the guys from Indellient, they probably have crazy stories, but like when you do consulting and you're like boots on the ground at customer sites, like you will have crazy stories. You will have seen some shit. And like, I did that for a year and was like, I think I've seen enough. I think I'm like ready to kind of be involved in the process of making the thing, as opposed to the one that's kind of teaching people and kind of being the coach. So I actually from there moved onto the Habitat project. So that was 4 years ago now. And I came in as the community engineering lead for Habitat. And my time since then has just been focused on that. So for a while I was doing a lot of developer relations stuff, flying all over the world and trying to teach people how to use Habitat, trying to teach people what problems we were trying to solve. I was doing a lot of kind of product-y stuff with our product owner. We were kind of attached at the hip from the kind of a two-pronged approach to the project. And then eventually I just like started doing engineering full time. And now I've been working on as a full-time engineer for 3 years. So I only did that for a year, and then I just all of a sudden was doing engineering, and I'm now mostly responsible for Builder. So our Habitat ecosystem consists of our client and our server, and our server being the Builder web services or the Builder on-prem services. And so I've been working on those now for 3 years, and that is now my wheelhouse, as it were. Now you're all caught up. You know everything there is to know about me.
That's awesome. There was something you said and it triggered a question, but then everything else at the end overrode it in my mind. So if I remember my question, I will ask
Sure.
it later.
Yeah,
It is
absolutely.
related to Builder somehow, but oh, I think I was gonna ask like about on-prem Builder. That's like a pretty big feature announcement that's come out like within the last was it with Habitat 1.5 that on-prem Builder was like fully deployed?
I don't know.
Maybe I should ask the product owner that question.
I mean, like, so on-prem Builder has been a thing for a while, but I think there was some point where the company felt like we're to a point now where we're ready to like push this as a way for people to, and I think that it may have been Habitat 1.5, but I think it might have been more once we finally got it integrated into the Automate deployment. So that our Automate users could deploy that, have access to it with very little configuration required and low touch kind of experience. That might have been when, we have Builder is weird because it's not on the same delivery schedule as the Habitat CLI.
Yeah.
And so there's lots and lots of features that are happening there at any given time, and it's kind of hard. Marketing has their own schedule. We have our own schedule, and it's hard to keep track of how the information gets disseminated out to the people.
It is hard to keep track. And as the developer advocate, that's kind of my job. So I'm like, yep. But we're working on that program. So let's move on. And I would like to introduce the two engineers that are joining us today from Indellient, Siraj, Rauff. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
More or less. I gotta be honest,
right.
I don't even think I pronounce it correctly, so if it sounds like it, it's good enough.
All right, fair enough. Well, Siraj, will you tell us a little bit about your history and how you kind of came to be working with Habitat and Chef software?
Sure. So mine's not nearly as long. I'm quite a bit younger, but video games, as always, started the journey. Spent way too much time on a computer, and honestly, this was back in the day when the computer would often just not act the way that you thought it was going to act. The router would go down, so you opened up a terminal, you kind of figured out what things do, and then it got interesting. High school, university, I'm like, I want to take that course. Originally, I think I even went to university thinking I'm going to do video game design, but so I ended up saying, okay, software engineering is kind of like what it would seem to fit that. Turns out, no, video game design is a lot more creative, and I'm not very creative. So full stack developer at first. So I did full stack for quite a few years. Actually, I never did stop doing full stack, but how did I get into automation? So a couple of years ago, I was working as a full stack dev, had like a typical Spring Boot application. We were like software as a service. It was very interesting because my team was brilliant. Like they were all brilliant, like software engineers and whatnot, but our ops side was atrocious. Like a deployment would be, we'd manually go into a box, we'd stop a particular jar, we'd do what we needed to do. We had to manually take it out of a load balancer. None of us really knew how to like automate things. None of us, like the most our CI did was kind of build once we merged, not even like before merge. There wasn't really much checks on that. And one day I got a call from one of my friends working at Indellient who's like, okay, I work in DevOps. And at the time I didn't even know what DevOps was. I asked him, is ops? Like, are you dev or you ops? Those are different words. I don't understand. But he kind of explained it to me. He's like, no, you'll still write code. You'll still do all this. I joined Indellient, and Indellient being a chef partner, I learned Hab right from the get-go. And I was actually on the Windows side to begin with, so I saw a lot of content put out by Matt Wrock, a lot of issues where I was following that he was commenting on. So I'm very used to his work. But yeah, I learned that, and it turns out you don't need to manually go onto a box SSH and stop a jar. You can actually just automate everything, it turns out, which is wonderful. But yeah, been in Indellient been working with Habitat for I think just a little under 2 years. So obviously we're consultants. So I think my title is DevOps specialist. It's essentially consultant and full stack dev. So work with a number of different clients as a chef partner, and we help enable them to use Habitat. So that means taking homegrown applications, taking third-party off-the-shelf COTS applications, bringing them into the Habitat world, showing them how you'd essentially deploy them. A big part of that would definitely be pipelines, because I think that's one of the biggest value adds of Habitat, a common kind of interface for everybody. Every Habitat app builds the same way. You generally have the same kind of way to manage and configure it. So we usually had to help integrate those type of pipelines with other software, make it more visible, and essentially get kind of all these workflows together, which Habitat helps greatly with. And that's my spiel.
That's awesome. If I were like good at the GIF game, I would get that like clip of Will Ferrell from Zoolander. Hansel, he's so hot right now. Pipelines, they're so hot right now.
Oh my goodness. They really are.
They are. And I wrote it down too, because like once Ryan introduces himself, we're definitely coming back to the pipeline discussion. I think that's a very hot topic. So and Yonk2 says, Siraj, aka the supervisor whisperer.
You stole my line. I was about to introduce him to that.
You know what? I was going to explain it, but you know what? I want to hear what Ryan's going to say about this now.
Well, yeah, Ryan, why don't you introduce yourself, your multiple selves, and please do share what the supervisor whisperer means as well.
I'll try to weave it into the story. So yeah, I mean, as I was listening to Ian's introduction, very similar path for me. Started out, I went to university not for English but for environmental science. Depending on how you look at it, equally as useless to Habitat. But yeah, so from that degree, I back to my video game roots. Once I realized I wasn't going to make it as a Counter-Strike professional, I quickly switched over to starting in the sort of front lines of IT, and I worked a number of years as sort of doing help desk type stuff at law firms. Transitioned into the sort of classic Windows sysadmin role, Oftentimes at sort of smaller companies where I was sort of the lone wolf, I was making all the decisions because no one else really had a technical opinion about things. And so you learn a lot in that position in terms of how to survive, which software to rely on, things like that. And yeah, about, I want to say 8 years, I left the whole law firm scene, and there's a small company called Indellient that my friend worked at. And I joined Indellient when I think there was, I want to say no more than 40 people. And we've since grown to over 100. I think we're maybe up in the 120s now. Maybe Siraj fact check me. But yeah, I joined as a systems administrator, kind of overhauled all their networking and sort of routing and switching, a lot of their VMware operations, their backup and recovery type things, classic system and tasks. And I spent about 2 years doing that until I sort of got bored of doing the same old system and routine. I'd kind of reached my cap as the lone wolf. I've always been in that position, doing the same things. And it just so happened that Indellient started their DevOps services division right around that time. So I asked my boss at the time, I said, I think I could switch. And I got thrown into the wide world of DevOps. And because of our tight partnership with Chef, which already existed at that time, I got thrown right into the world of Chef. Some Chef Infra, mostly Chef Habitat. And so I feel like I've sort of rode the Habitat wave from kind of not necessarily its inception, but maybe its public inception was when it started to gain some public interest. So I started a bit before Siraj. I remember pulling up a chair when he first started and walking him through this whole Habitat Studio workflow. And now he's graduated to the title of Supervisor Whisperer. So I take some, if not all, credit for that title. I should expose Yonk in the chat. He's also one of our colleagues. He does the same type of consulting work that Siraj and I do.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Siraj and I, we do a lot of the same things, but we come from different backgrounds. So I often take the more sysadmin approach to things, which means I like really well-documented stuff. I don't want to have to make it myself. Just give me something commercial off the shelf. And so that perspective is interesting at times. But yeah, I'm loving everything so far. And I should mention, I don't think Siraj did. We might talk about a bit later on. Is Indellient sort of spun off and made their own product under the title of ShuttleOps. And ShuttleOps is sort of a no-code, sort of all-in-one platform for doing Habitat service deployments across all the major cloud environments like AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. And I think Siraj, if we have time, we'll demo that a bit. But yeah, the backbone of that product is largely Chef Habitat. And so we've done some cool things in that area too.
That's awesome. That's actually a really good segue into maybe a demo from Siraj if you're ready right now. If not, we can like totally converse and stall hand
I'm
wave,
good to
as
go.
my coworkers call it.
I'm good to go. Yeah, we can show ShuttleOps. So
but
I think
first,
before I even
sorry.
yeah.
Before we go into that, I do want to shout out to a couple of people in the audience who are like maybe first time or not first time, but certainly not regular viewers. Edmund Hasselwater is in the audience, and Edmund is also one of the people who benefits greatly from the work that both of you, both teams, have done on this call. He provides a lot of our quality training in Europe. He's an amazing training provider, and so he he's been pinging me in community Slack, like asking when are we going to have Habitat enablement and Habitat training. And so Siraj, the work that you did on that training was like a huge was awesome to be able to like hand something over that was as put together and awesome as that was. So hello Edmund, nice to see you. lurking there. And also lurking in the chat is JJ Asgar, who is a longtime chef community member. So I just want to say, hey, JJ, how's it going? And also Resvel G. I don't know who you are, but thanks for pointing that out. So on that note, Siraj, would you first talk a little bit more about what shuttle ops is, and kind of maybe the like tech that went into it, and then a demo would be awesome if you can.
Sure. So I'd love to talk about where it came from because I think you already mentioned I did some enablement stuff, and it's kind of born out of a lot of the consulting work we did. So as I said, like Habitat gave us a very good platform to be able to kind of wrap any application that that our clients would have. So it could be like homegrown applications, it could be third-party off-the-shelf applications, and we'd essentially go in. A lot of times there would be kind of similar engagements where sometimes we'd toss up entire development environments for them, and what that meant is that like we'd say, what do you want for CI/CD? What do you want for like Artifactory storage kind of stuff? What do you want for, all these different parts of actually enabling your developers to be able to deliver your app more easily, more quickly. So what we did is we actually leveraged Habitat at the time, and we had Jenkins, for example, packaged up. We had Nexus. We would integrate all of these with like Habitat pipelines where, for example, on a pull request, we would automatically build a Habitat package, toss up a ephemeral environment, and they'd be able to test it, merge it, and we'd be able to automatically push it to their development or staging environment so they could do further validation. So we did a lot of this type of consulting, and we'd also help them, again, build those Habitat packages. And at the time, we were using a lot of Terraform for the actual infrastructure. So that, for example, for that PR validation, those ephemeral environments would come from that, including also actually their long-lived environments. So what we'd see over time is that we started from kind of a naive place where we blurred the line a bit of like, okay, what is infrastructure automation? What is configuration management? What is application automation? Like where does the line end between them? Because for example, you can write some Terraform that will load a Habitat package. You can apply a configuration, but then what happens when you want to change that configuration? Because Habitat makes it super simple, but if you're applying it in your Terraform, the interesting thing you'll see is that you can apply a different configuration and it'll update. But let's say you want to scale your servers up to 2 servers, your Terraform no longer represents kind of your new configuration. So these are the kind of problems that we start to see almost right away when we kind of started with the naive approach. This was back when we were kind of newer to Habitat. So we realized very quickly that we kind of wanted almost kind of like a UI slapped on top of this. I want to say with like to be analogous to Chef Infra, sorry. You'd have the actual infra client, and it would talk to the server, and like you could go to your server and here were your configurations. You could see your nodes and their attributes. But we were wondering, okay, how do we do that with Habitat, because it has a super powerful like configuration management solution, which I think I even prefer to kind of like how Chef handles its attributes. But then with the lack of like a Chef server almost like utility, we were like, how do we blur those lines? How do we actually make this accessible to everybody? Including managing the supervisor itself, as well as I think the biggest pain point at the time was non-developer folk were often turned off by Habitat because it was super powerful, but at the time, we were like, okay, if you want your manager to come in and say, okay, what do we have deployed in this environment? With they were used to an Automate UI, they were used to Chef server and whatnot. So we kind of decided to build a product on this. So as I mentioned, I'm a full stack dev and I haven't stopped. So what we essentially did is we built a web application. So let me share my screen at this point.
And maybe while Siraj just pulls that up, I guess it's like the larger construct here is like the centralized approach to Chef server versus sort of the decentralized approach of Habitat, right? I think it's kind of a good way to summarize it. And when you move to that decentralized approach, the complexity comes in there. How do you handle the bootstrapping of the Habitat supervisor, for example? I'll give a shout out to Young in the chat. He just did a ChefConf presentation on the Chef effortless workflow for those of you that are familiar with it. I think he called it something like "is effortless or some witty name like that. Jan, you can correct me in the chat if you need to. But yeah, part of that transition, if you're trying to move from something like a Chef Infra, Chef Server approach to Habitat, you really have to give some thought to how you're going to handle the provisioning of the supervisor and its configuration over its life cycle. And so that's a large part of the purpose of ShuttleOps. It sort of dumbs that down to the, you don't have to worry about those things so much because you're doing it under a convenient interface.
All right, so getting back to this, so I'm going to demo. I'm going to do a pretty simple demo. Should be just 3 small parts here, and I'm kind of going to talk through a bit of the habitat side of this as I go on. So this is ShuttleOps. Actually, maybe start from this screen. This is ShuttleOps, so you can log in with. Actually, I should probably say I have some feature flags turned on as a dev. So normally you'd log in through GitHub, but as you can see, we're working on integrations with GitLab and Bitbucket. They do actually work. I don't think we've released them yet, so probably should say that from the get-go. Ryan mentioned earlier that we have integrations with multiple different clouds. So you can see here we have integrations with Azure and GCP. I think today, that's rolling up soon. I think today we're only offering AWS at the moment, but as you can see, there's clearly a roadmap here, and there's much more to come. But I have some integration set up here. I logged in with GitHub, so I have GitHub set up. I previously actually set up AWS where I added in credentials because I will be deploying to AWS today. And I have a Habitat Builder integration, which I actually have 2. So what's interesting here is I have the public Habitat Builder, but I actually have an on-prem builder that I'm using as well for some of my deployments. But I've essentially set both of those up. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today, but essentially I'm going to be able to deploy packages in, for example, my origin and not just the core origin today. So I'm going to start off by showing how to actually build an application using ShuttleOps. And I do want to shout out here saying that like this is so easy because of the platform that Habitat provides. Because what I'm essentially going to do here is first, sorry, let me back up a moment. I'm going to add a code task here in my pipeline. So this is essentially a build pipeline, and we have code here. So what I'm going to do is add a particular element here. Sorry, let me make this a little bigger because you can see here, because I have multiple integrations and I have multiple different origins in the actual builder that I own, I can select which particular origin I'm going to build to. In this case, I'm just going to use my default one, which is named after me incredibly creatively. So I'm going to go ahead and now pick my repo. I do want to note actually before.
Sorry to cut you off. Did you take Supervisor Whisper origin, or should I snap that up right now?
Oh man, I hadn't considered that, but now I'm really hoping before I'm done this demo, it's not gone. Actually, quick note before I get too much into this, the plans I'm going to build are open source. They're usually under Indellient. I did fork it just for the sake of this demo, but it's called Liftoff Modern Application Automation. That said, going back to here, I'm just going to go ahead and click on my repo. So I get a plan file not found, and I'm going to configure this because this was actually used for a chef sales event earlier this year, actually in chef offices, and there's actually multiple plans inside this particular repo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually build Vault as part of this. So we kind of had a demo Vault set up here, and the way this is set up is that it's under Habitat Plans Vault, and then we actually have the plan file right here. So for those of you that are familiar with Habitat, you'll recognize that this essentially this folder as a Habitat plan. So there's actually the plan file, hooks folder configuration. We'll probably get more into the weeds soon. But an interesting thing to note from the get-go, just as a beginner, is that to actually build this now, so let's just say like I'm an ops person that's new to this, I don't actually need to know the particulars of this application. I don't need to know like, where its source files are or whatnot. That's all going to be encapsulated as code in the plan. So what I can actually just do here is put that path that I had specified before. I'm going to hit save, and hopefully it's going to validate correctly. All right, so we're good to go here. And I can just hit launch. So that's interesting because my build is kicked off, but I've entered like close to no information. I've essentially just pointed at a plan. And I think a lot of DevOps folks are going to be used to this in terms of Chef Infra, in terms of Inspec. We're used to kind of now being able to represent stuff as code. And we're going to see how powerful that is with the actual, with Habitat throughout this stream, hopefully. So this is actually going to take a minute to build. We do have a free tier in ShuttleOps. Obviously, there's a paid tier. There is a free tier, and everybody has access to a number of build minutes a month. So what it's going to do is actually going to toss up an ephemeral build environment and get going with that. But what I'm going to quickly do is show a deployment while that's building, because I don't want you guys to just sit here watching that build. I already do have a Habitat package
You should
Um,
see the you should see the episodes where I'm doing Terraform builds and it's taking like 20 minutes. Don't
Actually,
worry about it, but
I came armed, Jody. I have one if you want me to join you in that.
I've definitely done that before. This sales event, I was actually the one who did this, and there was. I remember at the end of the sales event, people were like, "Oh, you talked a lot." I'm like, "Yeah, I was waiting for everything to deploy," because every single example essentially had. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong folder. But essentially, all my examples had Terraform that had to run. And I was running it through. I'm not going to explain all of it, but I was just standing there. It would have been really awkward if I wasn't explaining all of this. So you can tell I'm at home with the stalling. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to quickly show a deployment pipeline here. So it's kind of a similar looking pipeline. Because I have an AWS integration set up, you can see that it's already kind of here in my pipeline. But this, as you can see here, we have a picture of a package here. This is what we're going to call application components, because we can add multiple as a single application. I'm just going to choose a super simple one, and this is actually going to be from that same repository. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick Grafana here, as you can see here. So Liftoff Modern Application Delivery is the origin, and Grafana is the actual package name. And hopefully we're going to get more into that, but I'm just going to blow through that right now. But I also want to select. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I got a quick question for you.
Sure.
JJ, who I mentioned earlier, he used to work at Chef Software, but now he works at IBM. And so he asked, "Oh, no IBM Cloud in there?" Do you have any plans to integrate with IBM Cloud?
So I will actually start off by saying I'm not sure if I should be talking about our product roadmap, because to be honest, I'm not very involved with marketing. So AWS is what we launched with.
That's fair.
So AWS is, yeah. I'll be vague. Let's do that. We start out with AWS. It's launch today with AWS. I know coming, I think this quarter or the next, we have GCP and Azure, as you probably saw. It is already working, but we're just kind of fixing up some of the kinks and whatnot. But then there is a page that exists somewhere that has all the clouds mentioned and a little bit of research into each, and like, you know, how much of our clients or how much of our, you know, of the community has kind of requested that. So I will say it's on a list. I'm not going to say we've committed to anything yet. I know we have a page. Actually, let me just plug that right now, shuttleops.io, in which you can actually, you know, contact us. And there are people who are much more well-versed with the actual marketing aspects than I am. And hopefully they'll be able to talk about cloud availability.
Nice.
So getting...
MC Splat says, "We missed you, JJ," and it is so true. JJ, we miss you. Anyway, go on.
I'm so not used to Twitch. I love this chat that's ongoing. It's so interactive. I actually like that. So let's do a deployment here. So as you can see here, we have what is essentially just some CPU tiers from AWS. So I'm just kind of going to blow through this. But what we'll do is we'll just select a specific type here. I'm going to select the T3A medium. The rest of the defaults look okay here. I will change the SSH key, I guess, to my key. And we also have security rules. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Okay, and we have 80 as a default. Maybe I'll just add port 22 for SSH if we need to debug anything, and I'll hit save. And there we go. We have a single instance. And what we're going to do is just hit launch here. And it's off. So this is kind of interesting because similar to the builds, just because of the way Habitat packages are both built and deployed, there's not much we need to actually ask, you know, the user for, like, you know, how do you run this application? There was no script involved because, again, all of it's codified. So this will probably take a minute or two, but hopefully we should see if we go to our manage page, we'll see that we actually do have an instance up, one component, one resource. And we have health. It's not exactly at full right now. That probably means our server is running, but our actual application hasn't been fully deployed yet. So what I'm going to do in the meantime, I'm just going to go back to builds, and I'm going to click on the pipeline that I'd executed. And hopefully we should see successful. I'm just going to click on logs for a moment, and what we'll see is, so for anybody who's actually used Habitat before, this should look quite familiar, but this is essentially a Habitat package being built. Again, because the actual plan itself was codified. So if I actually go back to the actual Habitat plan, it had its own instructions, for example, how to build, how to install, what it's going to depend on. And we can actually see that here. So for example, it depends on core curl, and we see that it's installing it. So again, I didn't have to specify anything. But what happens in the end is that it does finish building it. And eventually we actually have an artifact, a habitat artifact, as we can see here, that's going to be uploaded. So if I go to Builder or Depot, which Ian talked a lot about before, what I'll see is if I actually go to my origin, I can now see that I have Vault here. So I don't think I actually showed this before. So I guess everybody's just going to take my word for it because that's not very exciting otherwise. But I have a single release of Vault that was built into Public Builder using this. So what I'll do is while the other one's deploying, I'm actually just going to show a second deployment. This one's a little more going to be just a tiny bit more complex because I want to make this a little interesting for the folks that are used to Habitat. I'm going to go a little more quickly through this, but what I'll do is I'm going to select Console and I'm going to select Vault. This is going to be fun because it's a single application. It's essentially Vault that I'm going to be deploying, but I'm going to use Console as a backend. But the fun part about this is that for those of you that are familiar with Habitat will know that you can essentially use service discovery. So in this case, as you can see here, it's saying 0.1 consumer binds, and it is required for Vault. So what I'll do is I'm essentially going to tell Vault to look for this particular service group in Habitat, and it's going to use that to set itself up. And again, all of this behavior is actually codified. So if we go in the plan file, you'll actually see, for example, how it defines that and what it actually does with that particular bind. But as you can see here, they're now bound together. You can see 1 consumer binds. And I'm just going to quickly go through provisioning these.
I don't know about Ian, but are you thinking of on-prem builder at all with this, Ian?
Yeah, this is super cool. Yeah. This is incredibly cool.
Yeah, I'd like to try that. I'd like to try that with Builder.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that you totally could, especially if you've got, I mean, I'm just now learning the ins and outs of shuttle ops through this demo. So I'll have a lot of questions myself, but it seems really rad, like a pretty cool way to handle stuff.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with Habitat, for example, this is probably pretty cool. Like, again, I didn't specify really any of the like runtime bits of either Console or Vault, but I'm going to drop them each on a different instance. And we're going to say that we're going to use Habitat to be able to do service discovery. And what's cool here is I'm probably not going to do it now, but there is the ability here with these deploy pipelines to, for example, have builds be, or have certain actions be scheduled. Or for example, there's kind of approval gates or whatnot. So you can say, okay, your manager has to actually approve this before, for example, it deploys to production or an update's pushed out. Or for example, you can schedule it. So, okay, 3 a.m. on the Eastern Seaboard. So, you know, if your client's, you know, American on and off hours, you can actually deploy it. So there's a lot more workflow functionality built on top because Indellient has had experience with actual product development before. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy that. But while that's deployed, I'm just going to go back to my Grafana example. We'll see here that our health is 100%. That's using both the AWS APIs as well as the supervisor APIs. So we actually do take a look at the supervisor and we say, okay, is our application actually running? So I'm going to go ahead and click this, but what I'll see is I'm going to get connection refused. Now this is interesting because if I go back to my deploy page and I go ahead and click on edit for Grafana, I'm probably going to realize that if I actually go to the configuration for this, so I don't have any binds for this package, but I do actually have variables here, and we'll see that the port is set to 8,000. So I made a mistake here. I never actually opened this port up. But due to Habitat's configuration management, I'm just going to hit save here. I'm just going to hit launch again. If I go ahead and click on it, this time it's going to be a lot faster because it's not actually having to provision the actual infrastructure. It's just going to reconfigure that particular application. And it will take a moment or so for that message to go up. Actually, you can already see our health has gone down just a little bit because obviously the application has now gone down. Or yeah, the application has now gone down.
I think like at this point it's worth pausing and like thinking if you were to try to do the same thing with Terraform and you wanted to make that same change, what would you have to do, right? You don't have your hands on the supervisor or the service ring to say, I want to reconfigure you. You'd have to sort of tear down the whole thing and change the port in your Terraform config and bring it back up again, right? There's no, you don't have that same capability if you're tying your configuration to your actual deployment workflow, right? And that's just, yeah.
when you said it's worth imagining what you would have to do, and no, it's too painful to imagine. So can we not maybe? No,
Yeah.
that's such a good point. Like, I'm like speechless. This is pretty cool.
Honestly, a lot of this comes from our consulting experience. Like when you said imagine, me and Ryan had so many like late nights because we were like, oh, the configuration is now like out of date because we modified the ELB or something. And then, okay, well, you have that's a SSH but now you have the security groups. And now it's like, okay, who has the actual key and all that? And how do you actually go and reconfigure that? Oh, there were a lot of long nights.
Hey, just out of curiosity, when you were editing that that configuration, you know, that little screen that we saw with like the port and all that, is it under the hood? Is that like creating a user toml, or is it doing a had config apply? Like, how does that wire in? Just out of curiosity, you know,
Yeah.
what's that doing under the hood?
Total transparency, we are using user tomls. The main reason for that is that we realized when we were talking to a lot of clients, the layering of the configurations was a bit challenging sometimes, particularly because a lot of our clients would come from Chef Infra, and the order that they were used to, we told them, okay, you can have an environment level configuration. You have your default configuration, but you can also have machine specific configuration. And we wanted to enable that. There was just one little hiccup, which I think some of our clients found backwards, where it's your machine level configuration, they assumed would override the environment level configuration. So the user toml they assumed would have overrode the had config apply, but they found that not to be the case.
Right.
So we use user tomls, but we actually have this configuration at every single level. So you can apply it for a particular instance, you can apply it for an environment, but we kind of do it the other way where it's default.toml, machine, and then environment. But yeah, user tomls.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just curious when I saw that. Are you using Terraform under the hood to stand up?
No.
No, okay.
So we have some libraries there. This is so microservice architectured, so it's got a lot of languages here. The actual our infrastructure we toss up using a library in Ruby, but we do actually have an agent on the machine that we use Golang for, and we're essentially using that to configure the supervisor, being able to update all the different packages, and for example, to be able to put the user tomls in place.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have Grafana up here, which came up pretty quickly. The health is going up, but it is a little, I think it's time weighted a bit. So because it did go down in the last couple of minutes, it is still at 95%. But what I'll do is I'm just going to click on console at the moment. So this is going to be on port 8500, I believe. Yeah, so we have console up, and you can see we have both console and Vault here. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go to my AWS console. So which one is this? 16.
And you can think once again, Jody, if you have a microservice type workflow like this and you're trying to deploy it with Terraform, you get these very brittle connections you make, right? They're very, very easy to break if you need to go ahead and change one thing, right?
Yeah, this like all the work that I was doing, it was just really 3 servers or 2 servers really, a Chef Automate server with Chef Infra deployed as a service in that, and then a workstation.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, if I wanted to change something on the workstation, then like, yeah. Anyway, this would have made life so much easier.
I think you can say as well that it is possible with Chef Infra. It's just you have to give it a lot of thought, right? It's not something you can just jump right into. You really have to plan out your workflow if you're going to use sort of those classical tools.
Which I did not do very much of the planning thing.
And even us after like 2 years of trying to do this as sort of a sellable workflow, it's still not perfect, right? We're still shutoffs is still very new even for us, and so we're hoping to shift a lot of the legacy work we did over to this type of platform.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting too, because I think one of the coolest things about Habitat when we initially started doing it, like when you talked about how Chef Infra can do applications, a lot of our clients would want to would have come to us with applications already being deployed using Chef Infra, and they wanted to move to Habitat being the newer way to do the application automation. And it became a lot more accessible to almost everybody because Chef Infra was kind of like very, I don't want to say it was for devs because it was still like overall the DSL, like it was easy to understand. The docs were pretty good, but then having the simple, like having the bash scripts and having it all codified, like for example, the user toml, the default.toml, it spoke to, I feel like, a lot more people, in that you could talk to managers about it, you could talk to the ops people, you could talk to developers, and there was a very similar conversation going on. Like, okay, here's it running in the studio. Now here is it running in like production, and it's the same thing. And just it opened up a lot of barriers. Like, I think even with me and Ryan, for example, when we were consulting at first, it was interesting because he comes from an ops background, I come from a dev background, and Habitat was like that common language where we'd be able to talk to everybody. And Ryan would be talking to people. He's like, okay, I get your concerns. For the ops people, he'd be like, security and all this stuff, and I'd be like, I just want to run my application. Like, if it runs, like, you can deal with the rest. But there was using both of it. It was kind of like a mix of we spoke everybody's language. Like, everybody was kind of on the same page with that.
That's awesome. And it goes, like, not to get all sentimental and stuff and sappy, but that definitely goes back to like the principles of DevOps, like giving everybody a shared language so that they can all work toward the like what your common goal is. So yeah, anywho, cool.
Yeah, so that's my super quick demo. So we launched, console and Grafana. I should probably rename this.
I guess, Siraj, is it worth mentioning, like, so the reconfiguration you did for Grafana, for example, like the binding between console and Vault, if you change the port, are they going to respond together in that change? Like, if Vault's looking for console on 8400 and you make that change, is Vault just going to adjust essentially?
Yeah, so it actually does. Yeah, I feel like that's just getting more into bindings and shuttle ops, but it's super interesting because actually, let me bring up the code here for a second. Obviously, I'm going to do a little bit of a high-level overview here. Due to the
would you mind making the text a little bigger? Because that is,
oh yeah, 1 second.
I cannot read that.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to open this in Chrome because I have no idea how to make my IDE's text bigger. That's not something I've ever considered with with my text editor, I got to be honest. Okay, so let's try this now. Habitat plans. What we're going to do is go to Vault and go to config. So anybody who's deployed Vault before, one of the things you might notice, or one of the things you might know, is that you configure it using kind of this configuration format where you have a backend, and in this case, we were using console. Well, here, for example, we set the address using bind. So we say bind.backend.first.sys.ip. I'm not going to go into too much detail into like what that means in the Habitat world, but you'll notice it's not an actual value. It's essentially setting it to a path. And what's unique about that is when I actually set up the pipeline, let's just go back to that for a moment. What I had done is I had bound Vault to console. So for example, here we actually see the bind name backend, and I pointed it to an actual service group here. So if I actually go to Vault plan.sh, and you'll see this is actually codified right here. Package binds backend, and it's looking for a particular variable here. And what we can see is if we open the console version of this, so here's nope, this is still Vault. 1 second, I'm on the wrong page. Is this console? This is console. There we go. So this is console codified, which is really fun because it's only a couple lines and it represents a whole application. But this is essentially defining the actual package itself, not yet the runtime behaviors because that lives in the hooks folder. But what we can see here is this package exports a number of different variables here. So for example, we see our port HTTP here, and it's set to ports.http. And what we can see here is if we actually go up to console's default automa, which actually contains default values, and it's kind of a template for the actual configuration values for console, we're going to see ports.http as a path. And it actually has a value. And what's interesting about that is this is the same principle that Grafana had worked on, in that we didn't actually hard code, like for example, in our scripts or in our plan file, we didn't hard code saying like, okay, Grafana listens to port 8000, and that's what allowed me to reconfigure it. So when I applied that configuration, all of those scripts were re-rendered and they now use that new value. So in this particular case, console as well, it'll re-render that value, and Habitat is intelligent enough to also know to re-render Vault's configuration in this particular case, because as you can see here, again, so bind.backend, again, backend was just the name of our bind. first it's just grabbing the first service number in this particular case, but it's grabbing that actual value and inserting it here, that configuration.port HTTP. Now, obviously, this is all included in Habitat docs, so I'm not going to go too detailed into that, but this is all very dynamic. This isn't something where you have to worry about, okay, we now need to go onto that server and fiddle with things. Habitat is very intelligent and very dynamic in this sense.
This is awesome. And thank you for like walking us through the back end, and Ryan for asking that question, because this is pretty cool too. Like seeing the
I'm leading the witness.
The flexibility that you can kind of infer from that as well. So
yeah, this is totally cool. A quick question is, can you do this with Windows services and Windows boxes too? Just out of curiosity, I have to ask this because that's what I do.
I wouldn't have expected any other question. Yeah,
you can do it with Windows.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we do support Windows. So again, today it's only AWS. I think Azure is going to be big for the Windows folks, obviously coming up, and that is in our product map for I think the next quarter. But Windows is supported out of the box. Some of our clients, like Windows it's such a big thing because I feel like everybody uses it, but it's almost I don't know how to put this, but it's not usually glorified. It's not like the front end of DevOps. You usually think, oh, I'm going to deploy my Windows applications faster. So we have so many clients who are on Windows applications, and then they'll adopt certain DevOps kit, and they'll be like, oh, that doesn't work for Windows. And we wanted to make sure that we actually did support that crowd because Windows is so massive. I think one of the biggest adoptions was, I think for Habitat was a lot of people are moving off Windows, unsupported Windows Server versions, I remember, because with our clients, that was a big thing. So definitely making sure we're supporting that crowd. And really, by the way, I really do appreciate the work you've done on Windows. There's so many issues that I had starred or followed that I saw that you'd resolved later, because again, that was the world I was tossed into right from the get-go.
Awesome.
And the experience really is the same, Matt. Like we don't treat it any differently. It's great.
Yeah, that's great.
It's sometimes uncommon in the open source world.
Yeah.
Just a tad.
And I think it's kind of interesting too, because the Windows environment, at least in my experience, was a lot harder to kind of DevOpsify in a way than like Linux or Nix-based systems. So I think it's super important that like that work is done, and that we do focus on that that capability as well. So it's awesome that you guys are also like in the same boat. Cool. Thank you so much for that demo. That was pretty sweet. And I think on June 2nd, there will also be one of the sessions will be a shuttle ops session. Am I mistaken?
Yes, there is. So actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because I had forgotten the date, but for a much like higher level and also much kind of, I guess I went a little like right into the weeds almost, but for a lot of the kind of elevator pitch, more of shuttle ops, and I think a little more thorough of a demo as well. You can join that session because we have a lot more features. I just wanted to talk about like kind of the bits that stood out to me for like our Habitat experience, especially with consulting. Like this was the dream tool. You know how you when you're playing with a new DevOps tool, you're like, I wish we could do this. We kind of just went and tried to build that. So
I think as well as like on the system side, and I mentioned like the effortless pattern earlier, like the deployment workflow is the same, right? So we've been deploying applications here like Vault, Console, and Grafana, but yeah, we could have selected a Habitat package using the effortless pattern, which simply runs a hardening cookbook or something like that. And so now all of a sudden, all of your instances that you're deploying the same way get sort of baseline hardening, and you can have them report back to an Automate server, things like that. And it's all the same workflow, right? You're still just dealing with the same object, which is a Habitat package, which I think is super, super powerful.
That's very cool.
Yeah, Siraj, you said something that really resonated with me, and kind of my experience with Habitat as well, that I love to talk about anytime anyone will listen, and I have a captive audience right now. So I'm kidding, but one of the things that you mentioned was that like you can always use Chef Infra to handle your applications, but this kind of this common vocabulary that Habitat provides makes that experience a little bit different, and kind of and people are attracted to that in a way. And I'm super stoked to hear somebody say that as a person who's using Habitat, because that was by design, right? Like those were hard decisions that were made. There was blood spilt, people died on hills to come up with some of those things. And really what it comes down to is like, probably anybody who's done consulting or who's done an automation deployment from the ground up will have had a similar experience to this, which is this evolution that starts with, I need automation because I'm underwater, and I have app teams asking me for new infrastructure every day, and I can't get it built fast enough, and I'm having to push things out a week, 2 weeks, and it's because, like, for example, no offense to if you wrote this software, but it's because I need to not have to configure Kerberos ever again before I die, just ever again, right? And so you start down that path, and it's like, oh, this is going to be wonderful because I never have to configure Kerberos by hand ever again, and I'm going to feel so much better about that. And your throughput increases, and suddenly you're like, I can actually handle more work. So then you're automating more things. Instead of spending time configuring Kerberos, you're spending your time on this new piece of automation that's like, well, now that Kerberos is handled, maybe I can handle user account creation or patching, or, well, oh God, I shouldn't have said patching, or like, just the things that you do with automation. And there comes a point where you've automated so much of what it takes to deploy the infrastructure for your app teams that you have this crazy idea, right? It hits you like a bolt of lightning, and suddenly you're considering, could I deploy my applications with this? And you build that nasty, gnarly Rube Goldberg machine that's built on top of infra, which wasn't like designed initially for that, but could obviously be used to make that happen. And you get to a point where you're standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether or not you should continue to live or die, because the experience has been so harrowing that you've come out the other end a changed person, right? And I think that is the pain that Habitat was really specifically designed to solve. And there's obviously a little bit of overlap with infra. There's obviously a little bit of overlap. Like, we constantly get questions about, well, what about provisioning? And like, there are some hard limits there, and some hard decisions that had to be made. And that's not to say we got them all right by any stretch of the imagination. But it is really, really awesome to hear users who get it, who are in that space, and just like that like, I can retire now. I think we, like, mission accomplished, everyone. We can all go home.
I kind of got a question for you on that topic, Ian, if you don't mind. In
Sure,
terms of like
yeah.
the philosophy of infra versus Habitat, do you think there's kind of a certain subset of applications that are appropriate for infra, meaning like smaller agents and things like that? Or is it sort of a hard line you're drawing, saying like anything that is quote unquote an application should be, if you're in a greenfield situation, you should go with Habitat type thing, right?
There are very few things. There are very few things I believe in that have a hard line in them, other than like a predisposition towards Marxism. So like the I don't personally think that there's a hard line there. I think that the user has to determine for themselves and for their environment what makes sense. And I will also say, like, yeah, if you've built that Rube Goldberg machine and you're dropping marbles in it every day, and your apps are coming out the other end fine, like, marketing, please don't kill me for this. Like, maybe maybe migrating to Habitat is not the right thing. But I do think that people have to decide that for themselves. And I think it's so specific to the environment and not just like the environment, but like the people you're working with. Because one of the things that I experienced while I was doing a lot of the community engineering and growth stuff early on in the Habitat project is if you would talk to an ops team and talk to them about any kind of curiosity with Habitat, they're like, we have Chef, why would we need this? And if you talk to an engineering team and you would say, this is a new project from Chef for application, application deployment, application modeling, lifecycle management, they would say, I hate Chef and I don't want anything to do with it. And it was like grounded in that long time, the thing that the cultural revolution that DevOps was trying to inspire in businesses that like the ops and the dev people are working in tandem, and there was always kind of this animosity there. But when you would go to these people with different domains of concern, and you would not mention Chef at all, but talk about the problem space that you're trying to solve, you would immediately have overlap. So, which is like a really rambling and terrible way to say there is a space for infra here. There's always going to be a space for it. And because like the Kerberos example, like you're not going to configure Kerberos with Habitat. Like at least I would never suggest anybody do that. But yeah, I mean, like it could be that all you care about is dumping a COTS binary onto the file system, and that thing is going to run for the next 30 years, and no one's going to touch it. It has no configuration, and like, and maybe you don't care. Maybe like what you've got works. I think what people have to figure out is that like if there is pain, whether that's for operators or developers, if we can solve that in a different way, or if we can give users that same experience of increased throughput that they initially had with Chef for their applications, then we know we're like in a sweet spot for considering Habitat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've done some presentations on sort of that, not necessarily the migration, but the differences, right? Like what is the difference between infra and Habitat? I remember digging up a post, I think it was from you, from 2018. That sounded, I think you used some very key words in your just now finished speech about the complexity, right? And managing that. And I guess like when I think about that, is there a way to boil that reasoning down to like a technical reason? Like what is it about writing a cookbook? Not to put you on the spot, that makes you end up in that Rube Goldberg situation as opposed to writing the same thing in Habitat, right?
Yeah, and Matt may have different opinions on this than I do, because like like I said, my background is mostly Linux, and I think that they're like while we're delivering the same, we're delivering ones and zeros one way or the other. There's enough difference that that Matt might have a different opinion, but from a technical perspective, for me, I think back to the deployment cookbook that I had to write for a customer who I will not name when I was doing solo consulting. They had 300 applications that they were trying to migrate to the cloud, and of course, like, so it wasn't just like we're going to move these applications to the cloud. It's like we're going to move these applications to the cloud and we're going to automate all of them. Like, okay, so this is going to be a very, very different kind of death march than what you initially had bitten off. And that cookbook, it had to do a lot of things. It had to do a lot of things to be successful in order to deploy a single application, which was like, it basically had to care about state, which like just outside of the system, it had to care about state, which like, I don't think you really ever want a cookbook that needs to know about a system, the state of a system outside of convergence. And what I mean by that is like, that thing had to know about where in a pipeline a binary was, in order to determine what the deployment pattern might be, because there was more than one deployment pattern that had to be made. And that might mean also then integrating with an artifact storage system. And then there was a provisioning aspect to it, because of course that, you have to automate everything. So there's a provisioning aspect to it. And what it equated to was like a cookbook that was not just about like just laying the thing on the file system, was 10 or 12 different operations between 10 or 12 different systems. And like, and I don't know where in that spectrum is like, here's the line, here's where we don't do this anymore. But I know that was wrong, because like that cookbook should have been able to reach out to one location to get what it needed to put it down. It should have, if that artifact didn't contain atomically its own config, it should have laid down some config and it should have started the service. And that's all that cookbook should have done. But because of the necessity of reaching out to all of these external systems to make that a successful process, it turned into the Rube Goldberg.
That makes a lot of sense, because like I think if you look at Chef as a newcomer and you put like the rose tinted glasses on and you say like, what does it take to install an application? You're thinking, oh, I need a package resource or something along those lines, and then start a service. But I think to your point, in terms of when you're trying to implement those things into a large pipeline, it grows and grows and grows. And so does the amount of expertise and the number of people you need well versed in not only Chef DSL, but when you're doing more custom actions, you're talking about Ruby itself, right? As opposed to maybe just the bash and PowerShell of Habitat, which I would make the argument is more available in the workplace. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I'd be interested to hear. I know you mentioned Matt might disagree with you, but I'd be interested to hear his thoughts too.
It's I mean, it's interesting. This topic is super interesting, and like it comes up like all the time, naturally, right? Because like, for years and years and years, there was no Habitat. There was just Chef Infra. Chef was, there was just Chef, like what we call these different Chef products now. Well, a Chef was just Chef Infra. Like that's what we did. And we did what we had to do to get our applications out the door using that product. And now we have other options. And actually, I mean, my experience, I feel like resonates very, very much so with Ian. Like, I can remember, and I did work on some Linux too, just to put it out there. But we had some systems like in the previous company that I worked for, where basically what it comes down to this is once you need to start talking to other servers, things start getting painful at Chef. So like one way that I like to describe Chef Infra as opposed to Habitat is in Chef Infra, like the center point of your automation is the server. So all the automation that's tied at like making that server the server, as long as that's all self-standing and inside that one server, Chef Infra is great, and that's where it shines. Habitat, the center of automation is the application. And today, I mean, not 100% of the time, but so much, but more and more and more, our applications are spread out, across, multiple different servers. Our applications are really they're really a composition of multiple applications. And they all have to have like this awareness with one another to interact with one another. And so like, we've all used Chef Infra in the past to like, okay, I've got like this web front end that's got to talk to, my database that's got to like also talk to RabbitMQ, and I've got memcached off here. All this stuff has to like work together. And so I'm going to like hack up attributes, like crazy and do all this, create all these like custom Ruby. Oh, and I got to go learn Ruby now. And, this was like, I'll never forget like my first week on using Chef. It's like, and I was so disappointed too, because I thought I was going to love Ruby. So people don't hate me out there. I mean, there are some great things about Ruby, but I think
you got YAML now, right?
Yay! So, like, I had some expectations set up for me that like Ruby was just going to be like this angelic language sent from heaven, and it wasn't that. But at any rate, so like you have to, but like for me, like and people, I hope people don't hate on me for this, but people at Chef at the time, because I wasn't at Chef, but people at Chef would say, "Oh, you just have to know a little bit of Ruby, just a little bit." But to do like this thing that I was trying to do, like no, I had to learn a lot of Ruby, and I had, and then and one of the things about Ruby, and one of the reasons why the test community of Ruby is so big, is because if you don't test every single line of Ruby, the line that you didn't test is going to blow up at runtime, and you're going to be sorry. But so then we started, like, we're doing Chef unit tests and Chef infrastructure tests. And here's the kicker is, like, and one of the things for Linux and Windows changes on Linux, it's okay. On Windows, everything takes a really, really, really long time. And for a couple of reasons, right? Like, one is, and also I'm talking like 5 years ago, which isn't that long ago, but it actually Windows has come a long way. And so there was some provisioning stuff in there that just provisional, like today, it's actually a way faster to provision a Windows VM than it was back then. So there was that. There's some wonderfulness about Ruby on Windows that if depending on how things are structured, and at the time the way Chef was and a lot of other tools, just took a long time. Depending on how your gem layout was and all that, like just disks was at any rate, yeah. So at any rate, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off on a thing here, but so
sounds like you agree.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. But it is there definitely is no hard line. I think Ian was getting at it like this. Like it is tough. Like, and I think what customers want to hear, and I don't blame them at all, is like they want to hear, okay, they want like a nice if then, like if I'm this, then I'm over here. If I'm that, then I'm over here. And it's like, that is super hard to do. Like maybe for some cases, totally, but like if you've got stuff in Chef Infra and it's working for you, like Ian said, you already built the Ruth Goldberg machine and it's working, then don't, and you don't need to change it, then don't touch it, and that's great. But if you're working, if you're lucky enough to be working in a greenfield deployment, or something close to greenfield, then absolutely you want to take a close look at Habitat. And like I think you mentioned this too, Ryan. Like one of the things that I think people really like about Habitat, no matter what it is like they like the fact that they can do everything in like kind of the language that they're already familiar with. So like Bash or PowerShell. Right, exactly. Yeah. And like, so like you don't, even if you have to write some pretty, like for example, in fact, actually, Ryan, you and I worked together on this one project with SQL Server. Like we were doing this SQL Server clustered thing, and like you have to write a lot of fairly complicated PowerShell to automate all that. But it's nice, like if you have those skills already, to just be able to like go with those skills, and Habitat gives you like Habitat's not going to write that PowerShell for you, but at least you have a place to put that script. You know exactly what that script is doing because you wrote it, and you have a lot of control over how all that stuff gets run, and you can plug in runtime values into that. So that's pretty nice. But yeah, I think actually you're right. Yeah, me and Ian are in pretty good agreement here.
Yeah, I think we should coin a Ruby Goldberg machine.
Ruby Goldberg machine. Yeah, I like that. I will say, I think I do think if I'm remembering correctly, the blog post that you were referring to about complexity, I think it was probably grounded in kind of application architectures. And I think that's on the Hab team internally, how we've kind of done some of our internal communication about like when it makes more sense for a user to use Hab versus to use Infra or vice versa. Like I don't think there is a hard and fast rule, but I can say, kind of dovetailing off of what what Matt had to say. Like, if you think about modern application architectures and like serverless, serverless, and like that's a whole loaded term. We don't need to go there, but like when you think about the way that we compose applications today compared to like the monoliths of the early 2000s, like the way that we handle that is very, very different. And that's because we have better tools for binary, binary protocols between applications, for message queuing and stream processing. We have in the application development space had major leaps forward in the way that we can write applications, and that has decomposed those applications into smaller and smaller primitives, which is kind of what you see when you start talking to people about microservices, and we use that microservices term. But what that looks like in practice, I can say that like one of my teammates and I, Jeremy, this week have been talking about an upcoming feature, and we're doing a ton of architectural discussion and like looking at what it is we want to build, and like trying to figure out how to not overload some of the services that we have with different concerns that they don't need. And what that has evolved into is this conversation about systems architecture and about decomposing those primitives into the smallest, most manageable unit of work. And what that looks like is like we may for this one feature, it could be that we have to add 2 services or 3 services. And those services are really like, I get a message off of the network that I know I'm looking for, and I run a function, and that's it. And I think that is, when you're thinking about those architectures and thinking about the amount of mental overhead that might be involved to deploy an application that's structured like that, that's probably a good place to try to determine whether it's right to continue to use Chef Infra versus Chef Habitat. I can't imagine, with what we were talking about this week, wanting to have to write cookbooks to deploy a function like in the scope of a microservices cluster. I can't imagine wanting to do that. Granted, I've been using Habitat explicitly for 4 years, so grain of salt.
What you're saying, the parallels between where software is going and that sort of decoupled microservice type architecture is pretty clearly creates a concentration of the issues you described earlier, right? With cookbooks, and making sure that cookbooks are inter-aware, if that's even a term, but like if they're aware of each other, they know each other's state and things like that. That is something very implicit to the microservice model, and I think it just makes a lot of sense that those things are at odds, right? Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the chat, Rishi Outpost brought up a good kind of maybe elevator pitch for which one you pick if you're starting out, and that's what your area of focus is and what your cognitive load is, and that kind of reflects basically what everybody has been saying is like, if it makes sense and you know how to make that Ruby Goldberg machine, then like maybe do that, and it could be beautiful, and like the dominoes at the end could spell out your name in cursive or something, and it'll be amazing. But also, if you don't have time to learn Ruby, or if you don't have time to learn if you know Ruby, or you kind of understand the basics there and you don't have time to learn application delivery and services, package dependencies and all that kind of stuff, then maybe you start with infra. And like, that's a very good summation, Rishi Outpost. Thank you for that.
I guess I will. Sorry, go ahead, George.
I feel like that brings up a couple thoughts, because I feel like as you guys talk, I realized both talking to clients and my own experience, I think one of the biggest things about, especially in a greenfield scenario, I think one of the things about Habitat is that it just comes with all the plumbing that you'd otherwise have to kind of invent yourself. Because I know that, for example, microservices, like I think the state was a big thing. Just like, okay, as soon as you're scaling, whether it's horizontally, whether or vertically, actually, well, more horizontally, I suppose, but scaling and then being able to still interact with a lot of systems. I know that Habitat has been like, it lends itself to that. For example, the concept of like having different topologies, having update strategies. I know with one client, for example, one of the things I worked on is using health checks, using update strategies, using the supervisor API. We had an actual F5 be able to pull out nodes from the actual deployment as they were being updated. And the thing is, it was so flexible in the sense that like they had actually cookbook code that initially at least had most of the functions that were able to do it, just not as gracefully. Like it would be able to pull out, it would talk to the API, be able to, for example, pull out a particular server. But now we were able to say that if a server is unhealthy, so for whatever reason it got hammered, it went down, it would like the supervisor, the health check and the supervisor API already kind of had that functionality in the sense that we didn't have to code to specific situations. It was very much just like, it was almost kind of like a declarative pipeline in Jenkins. Like you say what you want and not try to code every individual aspect of it. And I kind of find that for just the way that applications are templated, even because I'm just thinking of certain Elasticsearch kind of modules, or rather Elastic Beats that I'd use, and actually no, different applications, because this includes like Logstash. I remember when I was working on kind of like cookbooks with applications, for example, adding a node attribute, making sure you had the correct checks in place. But when I was doing these applications, it's like I just specify a TOML in the config. I just say to YAML, and it would work. And then the interesting thing is that was from the default .toml, but I could apply a whole other config on top that would just be different. And it was almost like the flexibility of the fact that this is an application. And I didn't really have to go through the motions of kind of making sure that the attributes were passed through, like, for example, the correct, depending on how you, for example, if you're layering cookbooks, like pass through certain environments, and everybody usually ends up at that level of complexity where it becomes more and more effort to change smaller and smaller bits of that application. And I think that's kind of a big point for me, because it brings that all down to, I think, Ian, as you're saying, kind of like that manageable size. It makes everything kind of have its own place and purpose, and it has all of that architecture already in place, and you just kind of have to plug it in. Yeah, I don't know if that really made sense, but that's been my experience with Habitat packages, and why I feel like once you get into the Habitat world, you can't go back. I can't really, like, in my deployments, I was like thinking, if I had to actually write a cookbook for half the apps that, like, shuttle ops, the demo I just gave, all of those components are running on Habitat. And to, like, just the way we can even control like environment, be able to, for example, have releases, have deployments, like it's so dead simple that I can't even begin to fathom how I would have done it before now.
Yeah.
Well, surprise, Siraj. This is actually a chef intervention specifically for you.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've experienced that too, like on the Hab team. One of the early decisions we made, and this is like, oh man, I hope I don't get in trouble for anything that I've said here today. One of the early decisions we made on the Habitat team was that for any live services we needed to run, we had to be able to run them with Habitat without having to write a cookbook. So like, which isn't to say that like that's the way you should do it. That's just to be very clear. That's not what's being said. It was an artificial limitation we put on ourselves because we needed to be able to prove to ourselves that running services with this thing made sense, start to finish, and that we would be willing to use it ourselves, because like it's a thing that happens a lot, I think, in tech generally, when people work on projects and they're like, I wrote a thing to make this widget. And it's like, did you need that widget? Did you personally ever need that widget or need that tool to make that widget? If you didn't, then how do you know that it's the right shape? And so that's kind of been a guiding principle for us, is like Builder today, we don't use any chef infra for Builder today because it's like the first line. Builder is like a self-hosting system. And so it's like the first line where we can test changes to habitat and kind of what that deployment looks like, what it feels like. And we have multiple environments that we can test that in, but it's kind of bound up in the process of like dog fooding. And yeah, I mean, I think it's colored our opinions in some weird, unexpected ways, I think.
That is incredibly interesting to hear, and I'm so glad to hear that, because with Shuttle Ops, we kind of we're doing similar, where we were deploying like parts of our staging environment with prod, and as we were going along, and we're like, well, is this actually useful? Because we wanted to, like, we were already using Habitat for everything, so we were trying to get, you know, what we felt was like the workflow bits around that, especially like interacting with source control and all that. So we actually did similar, and it's nice to know. Like, it is a good strategy, because then we're like, do we need this? Yeah, we really do. Like, to do this in a particular way, to make this useful, to have this provide value to, you know, multiple members, like, and it really helps you focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, our workflow is pretty straightforward, because we are, I don't want to say we're continuous. Well, we are continuous delivery to our acceptance environment. So like, Builder builds itself. So we have all of our repos are hooked up to Builder, and are hooked up to live Builder, which builds packages on merge. So anytime we merge anything for the Builder repos, they get built, and those go out directly to our acceptance environment. So our acceptance Builder services are actually supervisors watching live Builder, so that we can test the changes to Builder that get built by Builder. So that's fun.
I have a question about that, Ian, if you don't mind. How did you get the packages on the Builder built by Builder? If that makes sense.
So that is a complicated question.
Yeah, we don't have to go into it. 2 sentences if it's possible.
Yeah. So I mean, that's effectively like bootstrapping a new platform. So we had the packages first, because we built the entire, like, this is back. I wish Fletcher was, or I should have messaged him to see if he could come on and bother us in chat. But we built the entire build tool chain without Builder first. And once we had that, we were able to build Habitat packages from that. So we were building locally and in some isolated environments in the studio with some scripts, until we could get the build tool chain correct. Then once it was correct, we were then able to build Builder with it, and we just uploaded the packages directly. And then that was the starting point. So that was like the bootstrap. From there forward, we can do all of the reverse dependency mapping and all of that now. So, well, more talk about when we talk about upcoming features. But
yeah, it's a longer story. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
Well, I think all the talk about like whether you kind of start with Chef Infra or Chef Habitat is a good segue to ask sort of both sides, both teams. If I am starting out in Habitat world, or in trying to automate my application delivery to my infrastructure and stuff like that, what tips and tricks would you offer someone who's kind of like looking to start packaging applications with Habitat, but doesn't necessarily, like, for instance, if you say, oh yes, Habitat was written in Rust, and their eyes glaze over because they have no idea what you just said, what is your advice to that person?
It doesn't matter. Like, I mean, one thing that I think that's one of the key differences between the Habitat and Chef Infra is, like, yeah, it was written in Rust, but that's just what it was written in. But as far as like the user interface, to how like how you as a user of Habitat interact with Habitat, you don't ever need to know a single line of Rust. Like, it's just a non-issue. I mean, you can, and if you want to like deploy like if you're a REST developer, you want to deploy your REST application with Habitat, then go for it. That's what we do every day. But you need to know Bash or PowerShell, and fortunately, the likelihood of you knowing one of those two, depending on what platform you're working in, is going to be pretty darn high.
Yeah, this is a question that I have strong opinions on. Just because like there is a learning curve here. I don't want to for people that have tried Habitat and felt like this is very hard. I empathize with you. What we have seen is that if you don't know how software is built, not related to Habitat at all, but if you don't know how software is built, if you're an ops person who's maybe never had to manage software builds before, you might have a harder time getting started with Habitat. And the reason for that is because Habitat kind of seeks to push as much runtime concern as far left in the process of software development as possible, which means that as you start to use the tools, you will have to learn a little bit about the way that dependencies are managed. And so it can feel like, man, Habitat is really hard if you've never been exposed to that. But it's also very hard to communicate to people that like that pain isn't Habitat that you're feeling, right? Like that pain is building software is hard. And if you think this is hard, you should like do some reading on managing C libraries and dependencies, separate from this experience, because that's not to say that it's like, it is hard. It took me a while, I think, too, despite the fact that I've been building RPMs and other packages for years and years. But like, yeah, there's a learning curve there that's around what do I need? How do I even find out what I need? And if I could make a suggestion to new users and people that are kind of exploring, it would be around reading the core plans files that are in the repo. Like really read them, because there's some excellent examples in there that like any problem you might want to solve, most of them are going to be in that core plans repo, because we have everything from C libraries out to Leaf services, clustered Leaf services, and databases, and everything in between. So there are there's a massive library of useful content that you can go and look at. But also, I would highly recommend reading about just how software is compiled and how it's built.
I have also strong opinions in this area, especially coming from a systems background. I raised my hand earlier because I didn't know about what it was involved in sort of compiling software when I first started in this DevOps position at Indellient. And I quickly learned what it was, but it was the reason I was able to learn was because I'm surrounded by all these Siraj-like people that come from that background, and they can break it down and talk to me like a 5-year-old and say, this is exactly what's happening. And sure enough, eventually it clicks. But, and Jody, this is probably directed at you most because you're in this teaching position on the subject. But I've long wanted to put together some form of like a sandbox package, right? Not specifically dedicated to operations people, but me. If you just make a really silly Habitat package and you stick, for example, an ifconfig command in a hook, just to see what happens. Ipconfig, sorry, Matt. Or pick your poison. Doesn't matter. But just to see what happens, right? And same thing goes for the plan file, right? You put a command in one of the, a very basic command that anyone can understand, any operator can understand, any developer can understand, and just watch the behavior, right? Because when you look at the big picture, and this is what Siraj and I see when we go into rooms of 20 people, some of which are developers and some of which are operators, and we try to teach them about Habitat, is we run the first sample node app example, and the hand comes up and it's like, so now where's the Docker container? because they're focused on the result, right? They're focused on, okay, you built this artifact, but I'm used to this world where artifacts are operating system images. Artifacts contain OS, right? And the whole mantra of automation that travels with the application, I think, is a very powerful one. But I think it would be very beneficial to take that a bit further and say, okay, what do you really mean by that, right? And really, what you're doing is you're wrapping what are, to an operator, classic sort of installation and runtime scripts. You're just wrapping those around the application artifact, right? And so rather than wrapping the OS around the application artifact, you're just wrapping those scripts around them. And if you can boil it down to those terms and have a sandbox sort of package that illustrates those very fundamental concepts, I think it can help break down those barriers, right? Because I think sample node app to some degree is even too much for someone who, like myself, especially with the abstraction of scaffolding. And I think we've kind of learned from that in some of the work Siraj has done. But yes, I can relate a lot to that newcomer, and I've just had the luxury of being surrounded by people who really understand these things to help me understand it. And I think some of those ideas I just threw out would be really beneficial to people, especially operators who are coming into it. Focus on the functions that are happening during the build phase, during the run phase. What is the service directory? What is the package directory? How do they interact and things like that, right? Yeah, I think that's what we've learned. I don't know if Siraj will echo that, but when you have rooms full of people asking the same questions over and over again, you quickly realize sort of what the source of the issue is. And that would be my perspective on it. Yeah.
It's super interesting that everybody, especially Ryan, talking about the learning curve from the ops perspective, because it's super interesting that when I was first learning it, and the learning curve cannot be understated. Like it's a learning curve for sure. And I think what's interesting is it's from both sides. As a developer that got into it, it was interesting to think of the automation because there's a lot of kind of newbie mistakes that you'll make. And I remember one of them is that in an init hook, you'll start a process and you just leave it. And then you check the log and it exits, the hook exits, and you're like, but I started it. Why is it looping? Why is it trying to start it again? And then, even for example, it's like, why is it running the init hook again? It's already been here like once. And honestly, I just wanted to start with saying, go through the learning, what's it called? Go through the track on Learn Chef Rally, because that cemented so much for me. I got to be honest. That even considering all the updates it's had, like I initially did it, I think some years ago, and it's been updated since then. But it was so helpful even then. I think, for example,
I'll play devil's advocate and say it wasn't helpful to me 2 years back.
That is spicy. Okay, but as a programmer, I will say, like, because I had different concerns. I remember, for example, and this is going to sound like incredibly lame to anybody who's done ops, but when I first started getting into this sphere of like automation and whatnot, okay, I have a package, I get how to download it, or I get how to upload it, I get how to download it, I put it on a VM, and the first thing I realized, I'm like, okay, I can't access it. And on Windows, like sometimes there's things like firewalls. On even just plain Linux, like this was in AWS, I hadn't set up my my security group rules. And if you're doing like local VMs, forward the ports. And a lot of the times a developer will live in an IDE world where you're not used to that. You can think in terms of like so much application complexity in an IDE, but if you have 6 IDE like Windows up, you never actually think about like the actual interactions in the real world. Like, what do you have to worry about? And I feel like that leads, like that in and of itself, maybe you can be babied through that, but it leads to so much better questions, because now what is the handoff? Who handles, for example, security groups? Like, do you read, like, do you, for example, have a variable in your Terraform that sets your security group and then passes that to the package as well? Because what if you reconfigure the package? So you start to think about these questions in terms of, and it's that shifting left again. It's that, how is this actually going to run? And I noticed that the way I actually code, because again, still coding like Java, Go, Ruby, the way I code has changed, because now it's like actually thinking about how is this going to run. It's thinking about the concept of, okay, you have a binary, what files are you going to interact with? Like idempotence is a big thing, because again, in the hooks, like for example, a lot of people in your first time, like I think this is a rite of passage in your init hook. Maybe you'll create a directory or you'll do this, and the second time you run the package, it fails because it's like, okay, this exists or this is like gone because you moved, for example, like your jar out of your package directory, and now it's like, well, where's your jar? And I'll see a lot of people do that. I'm like,
that's why sorry to cut you off. That's why I was focusing on that IP config example, right? Because you're so focused on like, oh, what magic could Node be pulling here, right? Like me as not a software developer, like who knows what's responsible for this, right? But if I'm just running a simple basic command, and to your point about the run hook, I see that I just put IP config in there once, and what do you mean this is just running infinitely, right? Step 2, oh, let's introduce you to this exit 0 concept of the run hook, and that is going to restart. And you can, like, I feel like I can honestly trace back the aha moments I had as an operations person trying to track this or understand this to each, you know, very, very simplified concept, right? Of here's where the file lands. You know, when you perform this operation during the build, it doesn't have anything to do with runtime. Like these very, very primitive concepts as part of the process. And you don't need a sample application to illustrate that, right? And if they see the way it works with IP config, and you just simply tell them at the end, okay, now replace IP config with your installation script for your application, right? That clicks for someone like me, at least, not coming from a software dev background.
Actually, yeah. So when we, because me and Ryan have done a lot of workshops on this, and Jody, I think you're very well aware that I was working with the chef enablement team before and like a lot of that stuff. But yeah, we noticed this because when we were in rooms with people. One of the parts of the workshops that we've done is that like we have them exit the studio, which I remember when I was first working with Habitat, there was a long time, not a long time, maybe at least a week or two of me just working specifically inside the studio, and I kind of like learned ins and outs of it. But then when I was outside the studio, I'm like, where is the supervisor? How do I load this? I thought the supervisor was part of the package. And it's interesting because I feel like when I went through the Learn Chef track, it made me go through all of the steps. So I understood where it landed on the machine. Okay, oh, the service directory exists even outside the studio. And it's interesting because you tend to also forget these over time because you become very used to all these concepts and all that, which is good because I guess that says that they're pretty like, the concepts all make intuitive sense, but you have to actually learn them. And that learning curve is a bit steep, but then everything suddenly makes sense and it's so powerful. But I think like from the get-go, I think Ryan raised a really good point. Like I've seen so many clients try to, for example, they learn how to build a package. Now they try to shove everything in it. Here's my package. Maybe first try to run something very simple on a machine other than like your development machine. Learn how it actually like runs, see the hooks go through, reconfigure it. Because I think people also go overboard sometimes with like, okay, let's configure everything. Like this needs to be able to create the users, the directories, everything. And you're like, once you learn how it ends up on disk, how Habitat actually like, you know, has a service directory and configures templates, you don't need to do all that. Like this isn't, not that this is a hit against Chef Infra, but you know, the application automation plumbing is there. So learn how it goes together, like all of that, the studio, the supervisor, and like kind of the on-disk structure of the package and the service directories. And again, I think very important to kind of try a deployment right away. Maybe it's in a VM, but off the development machine, so maybe even a Vagrant box, but really helps cement your understanding, and then you really see where the powerful features of Habitat add value.
It's also interesting too because there's all sorts of different, like we've talked a lot here about packages for running your application service, but there's packaging for like command line utilities for, you know, that you at some point need to be packaged to like manage your build or manage things at runtime. Packages for packaging up like just runtimes, like how do I package Ruby? You know, how do I package, you know, Rust itself? And some of the and there's totally different concerns about that. Or like Ryan mentioned, how do I package maybe something that's a little infrastructure-y? For example, and I would definitely echo what Ian said, like look at the core plans repository. And we have a lot of plans in there that manage or configure IIS or configure different Windows features. And we have like a DISM, like really all that's in there is a DISM command. For those of you that know what DISM is, I apologize. You know, I feel sorry for you, but at any rate, it's like it's the one command where you can enable or disable Windows features that will actually work everywhere. So that's why that's in our core plans. But at any rate, you know, there's that, and then there's COTS applications. So like it's an actual application, actual service, but you don't have the source code. And sometimes it could be super easy. You know, I just, you know, put the binaries on there and it just runs. And sometimes it's like a horrific experience because like a lot of antivirus stuff out there, like this application wants to be God of your computer. And so, trying to like reverse engineer into that and figure out how can I package the thing that doesn't want to be packaged, and that's an extreme example. But there's other examples that aren't extreme where, there's definitely skills that you have to exercise to package this application. And it's not, there's a learning curve, and there's all these different learning curves. But I want to echo two things. One is, again, what Ian said, look at the core plans, because there's all sorts of different, like all these types of plans are in there. I mean, there's a ton of plans that are just like basic kind of utility plans that are in there. That's probably, I would say that's probably the majority, but there's absolutely apps in there. SQL Server is in there. So you can kind of think of that as COTS. And there's probably other stuff in there too. So look at that. And I would say, like, it's a good idea to go through like the basic kind of application tutorial. Like, so myself, at Chef, when Habitat first came out, I was not on the Habitat team. But there was a lot of hype around Habitat. And I remember the first ChefConf where either Habitat was announced or it was like right after Habitat was announced. And that was before I was on the team. It was before I really done anything with Habitat. I just wasn't getting it. And I felt stupid too. Like, come on, I've been doing this all this time. I look at all these people that are having these aha moments, and I just felt like, oh, I'm so dumb. But I'm just the type of person, I'm just not going to get it until I actually put my hands on it and create a package and run it. People are talking about shifting left and shifting right, and where's the keyboard and the code? So and we all learn differently. Some of us learn great, with pictures and infographics, and that's great. And some of us just need to spend an hour of silence and go through a tutorial. So
it's like you pick up this really complicated object and it's got bells, whistles, and knobs on it. I'm the type of person who's okay, if I turn this, what happens? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And that's the equivalent of what I was trying to say in the hooks example. Is let me try to poke this thing in the most minimal form and see how it responds. Right. And it's the same for a bash tutorial. It's almost like launching into functions and loops when the first thing you want to do is just output your host name or something like that. And I feel like there doesn't exist that tutorial at that basic level, and I think that could break down the barriers, I think, for people who are especially struggling with it.
Yeah.
Well, that is the perfect segue to plug a project that I am working on personally for ChefConf and the rest of my team, which is we're actually migrating the old Learn Chef Rally platform onto a whole new learning management platform. And in the process, we're going through and heavily combing through all of the modules that currently exist to both identify areas, like you're saying, where there are places where we can kind of add in some more knowledge opportunities or resources, but also to go through and remove stuff that hasn't been relevant in the chef sphere for 5 years now, or not 5 years, but I'm sure we're all very familiar with the fact that stuff moves pretty quickly in this industry. So after 3 years, I think is when we launched that platform, was 3 years ago. 3 years even is a lot. Habitat was introduced in those 3 years. So yeah. So on that note, look to June 2nd, our ChefConf announcements, our keynotes. We're actually going to be announcing and kind of giving a sort of sneak peek at the new platform, which is going live at ChefConf. So keep your eyes out for that. I will definitely gather like this feedback is super valuable, and especially I really appreciate the viewpoints of both like an ops side of things, or like I started out in ops and this is my viewpoint, and I started out in development and this is my viewpoint, because it is like really going back to what Rishi Outpost said too. It really has a lot to do with your context and your area of focus. Maybe how you start learning how Habitat works and how it can help you. And like, to all of your points, I started out in QA. So like my like introduction to software development was through debugging video games at Nintendo. And that it's not a super technical role there. You're literally playing video games 8 hours a day and then like trying to break stuff. But I like started that's where I came from. So I didn't get the education of like when you're a computer scientist or when you're a developer, you have to go through as you're writing your program and, for instance, determine how many resources it's going to use up. Like that's not ever a concept I had in my mind. And so like starting to learn Habitat when it was first announced, and like still continuing to learn it through the years, it's definitely like, oh, I actually need to understand like what is important to the application side of things, not just like whether I want to put this application in my infrastructure side of things. So that's awesome. Well, cool. We're like a little bit past our 2-hour mark. And I just want to be cognizant of other people's time, because my with ChefConf coming up, which I don't know if I've mentioned it yet in the last 2 hours or on the stream every single week, but my team has a lot of work we're doing. And so I just want to be cognizant of your time and let each of you drop if you need to, or if you still have questions for each other, or if anybody out in the chat has questions before we drop off, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll say we'll probably kill it soon, and then you can check out the recording of this stream later on YouTube as well. So yeah, I'll stop talking and open the floor to you all if you have questions for each other still.
I have one. I don't know. Okay, hopefully it doesn't go on too long. But so the whole shuttle ops concept. I don't know. I think what I've been craving is Chef's official messaging on like how you should manage a supervisor's life cycle, and I'm just curious what Ian and Matt think of that. Primarily because like our answer now is, you know, get on shuttle ops, right? that is what we've worked hard to get to that point. But for example, a customer that comes along and says, you know, we're on prem, shuttle ops doesn't support that yet. If Donna's watching yet. And if they're sort of on-prem and they're really on board with Habitat and they love the workflow, and I'm not expecting any miracle answers here, but maybe I'm curious, Matt, how would you go about managing that supervisor service if you need to reconfigure it over its life cycle and things of that nature? Yeah.
No, yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'll start off by saying that we do have the built-in ability for supervisors to update themselves. So there's a parameter you can pass when you know, this isn't the default, nor should it be, but there's a parameter that you can pass that you can say, hey, you know, supervisor, restart yourself. And it's important to be aware that when that happens, it's not interruptive to your services. So the way that the supervisor works, there's actually two binaries that are at play. There's the supervisor and what we call the launcher. And it's the launcher that's really in charge of launching your services. Basically, the supervisor is communicating So there is the ability for the supervisor to go down. Your services are still running. The launcher still has some awareness of them. Supervisor comes back up as a new supervisor and reestablishes communication. Everything's still good. So that said, you might be wondering, well, that sounds a little scary because you come out with a new supervisor. Do I know that supervisor's good? So, there are ways of managing that. So for example, in the example that you mentioned, if you're on-prem, maybe you don't pull in or sync in the most up-to-date supervisor before testing it somewhere. Or I believe, I can't remember if you can point that at a channel so you can promote the.
Yeah, if you're syncing from Public Builder, you can kind of control your own API channel.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so there's that. Of course, if you need to update.
What about like other flags and things like peer flags? It's a big one in mind for me, right? Which is making me feel like I need some sort of config management around the actual systemd unit or however you're running it. The Windows service or things like that.
To be honest, so like what we've done is, so we do a lot with Terraform when we stand up environments, and so like on the Windows side, and this is very similar with systemd. You've got a file somewhere that you create that kind of does all this, passes all those arguments, the peer argument being one of them. And so when just part of what we do, basically it's part of our provisioning automation, as we edit that file and when we're doing the provisioning, we know what the peer is, and we're using
like a permanent peer type model.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say, we're using a bastion ring. So we're giving it, the peer addresses for that bastion ring.
Yep.
So that's, but you bring up a good point, I think, like, so you can totally do it, people do it, but there's work involved there. And the shuttle op stuff looks pretty smooth. Like if you can, productize, just kind of streamlining that whole process, that sounds pretty darn awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of the answer I was expecting, and it seems to be what we've settled on. But yeah, it's really the effort involved in coming up with that system, and it would be good if at some point we can sort of consolidate that messaging into like, this is how your workflow should be, or publish something that makes it easier for people to approach, right? Yeah,
there's so much. I feel like, well, I don't just feel, I know that there's so much that we could be doing just in the documentation land. Like, I just gave, for example, this week I gave a workshop on, and it's just like, you just feel like so dirty and so bad. Like you want to like point them, and if you go here, this will tell you all about, how you do like what we just talked about just now. And like, oh man, that page doesn't exist, and I don't have time to write that page right now, and maybe I'm like one of two people in this world that know that information, and this sucks. And so I think there's a lot we can do to make that better. And like if we were to highlight like new features, I wish I could get really exciting, but that would be to me, like that would be a feature, is to like really like focus in on like some of those like some of those scenarios. Like our documentation is pretty cool, like this is a run hook, this is an init hook. The init hook gets called before the run hook, but like, so how do you really run these supervisors, in production in real life? I feel like we could do a better job with providing like good narrative content around that. Yeah.
That way I might be able to sleep, because I'm always second guessing myself. So I blame you, Matt. I'm waiting on the day. That's all I had, Jody. Sorry to prolong it for everybody, but there's a burning question within me. I had to get it out.
Don't be sorry at all. I asked you to ask questions, so you're golden.
Okay, so I can shift more blame now to Jody too. I'm responsible for nothing.
Cool. Well, any other comments or questions or shameless plugs that anybody wants to share? if not, let me check my Slack really quick to see if we're going to raid anybody this week. I don't have any messages, so we might just yes. So we will see you all next Friday. Oh, sorry, I'm like doing wrap up, and I forgot to say very firstly, thank you so much, Ian, Matt, Siraj, and Ryan for joining us today. And like seriously, this conversation, I said, I think before we went live on the stream, I am like selfishly, oh, and maybe it was in the intro, I'm selfishly like benefiting from this because it like everything you're talking about is helping me build out like my own path forward to help build out that content for Learn Chef and all the other stuff. So yeah, I'm like very selfishly excited that my job requires me to interview you and listen to you talk about things I wanted to know about anyway. So thank you. Thank you all for your time. And thank you for joining us and sharing all of that stuff. Thank you. Like Siraj and Ryan, holy cow, the stuff that you've worked on and that you've done, not just the shuttle ops stuff that you've shared, but also the work that you've done with like our clients or customers or whatever. It's we get to see that impact in like our general Slack channel when we have like the wins called out. So like I want to say like big thank you on behalf of the whole company to your whole company.
I've had nothing but positive interactions with working with Indellient, so and Indellient engineers. That's great work, you guys.
Likewise.
It's good to hear because we enjoyed. Oh, looks like we both went for it. What was that, Ryan?
It's so formal. I said likewise, Matt. Always a pleasure.
I was gonna say, damn it, I was gonna say similar. I was gonna be like, it's always been a pleasure working with the chef guys, so it's always pretty nice.
Nice.
That's one of my favorite things about my job is just working with the people that we get to work with.
Seriously.
Awesome. And Ian and Matt, thank you both also for joining this. I'm like, you have real jobs as well as like Ryan and Siraj have real jobs. You guys have real jobs. So I really appreciate you joining me to help me do my job and deliver some awesome content to our viewers. So I think with that, JJ is JJ Asgar, who I've mentioned a couple times on the stream now, is a developer advocate, I believe, at IBM. And so I think we're going to go raid his stream now. So stay tuned for more awesome technology conversation. And I don't know who 859JT is, but they asked if that's the Habitat. And I'm like,
oh yeah, his name's Carl. His name's Carl, but that's his professional title.
I like it.
Great.
Which also makes me his supervisor.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
I haven't been able to properly supervise my cat. Definitely a rogue service.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, okay, stay tuned and let JJ know that you are heading over there from our channel. Oh no, he's got raid turned off apparently, so we cannot raid him. But you can go there manually by navigating to twitch.tv/IBM developer. And JJ is an awesome guy and has like amazing insights. Whenever I talk to him, I come away with it like kind of mind blown sometimes about some of the like he makes very complex concepts very simple to understand. So head over to IBM Developer on Twitch TV. Oh, and apparently we are actually rating him just to switch things up every sentence that I say. So yes, we are rating JJ. Enjoy. Thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned next week for more ChefConf online stuff. Bye.
Thank you, Jody.
Thanks, Jody.
Thanks, Jody.
Thank you. Take
Thanks,
care.
guys.